Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third day of the HEDAYAH conference. Thank you for being here. My name, as already mentioned, is Mohammed Ibrahim. So I'm the Regional Counterterrorism Advisor for the EU based in Kenya. I cover 6 countries in the region within the Horn of Africa realm. That includes Somalia, Kenya, Ethiopia, Uganda, Djibouti, and Eritrea. I have over 20+ years experience in the region. So do not be fooled by my face, I'm not that young. We also have a very interactive and a very informative panel discussion after this, where experts will unpack so many themes that are relevant to recruitment and radicalization within the context of violent extremism. So for this reason, I don't want to start off with frameworks and data, but more important with a specific incident. So Mogadishu, Somalia, 30th August 2016. This beautiful hotel that you see before me is the Somali Youth League, a very famous, very important hotel that's quite close to Villa Somalia, which is the presidential palace. It's also one of Mogadishu's important landmarks. It's located near the it's located near the center, and also quite visited by politicians and a very high-level delegates. It's a gathering place, not just only for those high-level delegates, but also for the communities, also for expats and international visitors. Now, on 30th August 2016, I was there inside the hotel. I was in Mogadishu for a specific purpose. I was doing my doctoral field research on Al-Shabaab, and I was meeting a local contact. Now, I was fully aware of the risk, and I used to avoid areas that are quite symbolic when it comes to this type of area or this type of hotel. These are very symbolic targets for Al-Shabaab. And of course, this particular hotel has been targeted twice before, one in 2015, and the other one also quite early in 2016. So not just a typical hotel, it's actually a very attractive hotel for Al-Shabaab to target. But of course, I judged incorrectly, and I was there and accepted the risk. Looking back, my presence in the hotel, of course, is something that also illustrates when it comes to our policy work as well. In cities like Mogadishu, or whether it's in Kabul, or whether it's elsewhere, there's no routine, there's no predictability. The ordinary can easily quite catastrophic, and especially in an instant, things can change. Now, the hotel was very well guarded, high-level security, armed guards, blast barriers, metal detectors. Inside the courtyard, there was a functioning normalcy, sunlight, conversation, the sounds of a working establishment. But beneath that service, always, there was tension, and you can really sense that palpable tension. Mogadishu is a city that never fully relaxes. On that day, Al-Shabaab attacked the hotel, Aswa Hotel, for the 3rd time this time. First, gunfire, short burst. My initial assessment, of course, was very benign. In Mogadishu, of course, when it comes to, when you hear gunshots, it can be often government soldiers just firing in the air or celebrating something. But of course, my local interlocutor, who was there with me, recognized the pattern immediately. He noticed that there was combat. In Somalia, they call it Jabab Alin. So this was not a routine gunfire. There was actually a violent confrontation between the security forces and Al-Shabaab. The explosion happened. The ceiling above us fractured. The corridor filled with dust and debris. Disorientation was immediate. We moved into the hallway. The destruction was substantial. Injured people were everywhere. Attempted to exit. The movements were quite automatic, very sporadic. They were, of course, clearly traumatized and in shock. Downstairs, of course, soldiers were issuing warnings, saying that Al-Shabaab has entered the building. You need to really vacate the building as soon as possible. And you could see that the half of the hotel was practically gone from the blast. On that day, 26 people were confirmed dead, more injured. Al-Shabaab later claimed that almost 40 people died. Now, outside the perimeter, the skill also became quite clearer. The suicide truck bomb had destroyed the fortified entrance again clearly. Amongst the dead was a security guard that I spoke with early that morning. We had, of course, exchanged pleasantries, a brief conversation, actually, and hours later, he was gone. The people that I talked to after that suicide attack were really desensitized in terms of how they approached this incident. They said, you know what, we will start the repair straight away. So, of course, they were correct. SYL Hotel was reopened the next day. The facade was repaired, operations resumed. So we often describe this as resilience. In many respects, it is. But there's also a concerning dimension beneath that resilience. In contexts like Somalia, this form of resilience risks masking extreme violence as normal. Survival becomes routine. Adaptation becomes desensitization. And critically, the actors driving this violence, actors like Al-Shabaab and Islamic State's affiliates, remain as deeply entrenched as ever. So now, why begin with this account? Because it's straightforward. Abstract terms like push factors, pull factors, grievances, ideologies, frameworks, interventions are important to us to understand and very critical. And of course, analytical tools are extremely necessary. But we must not forget that behind every statistic, behind every recruitment figure, are individual human beings making choices in specific context. Context shaped by histories we may not fully understand, by clan dynamics we often simplify, and by governance failures that violent extremists often exploit. Unless we understand these contexts in their specificity, our policies will continue to be insufficiently targeted. They will address generalized problems rather than localized interventions and realities. And oftentimes, these can be bridged. And that brings me to the core argument, or the core theme of this presentation. Context is not merely important, it's a big pillar. The Horn of Africa is not a monolithic region. Somalia is not a monolithic country, even when Al-Shabaab recruitment dynamics can vary dramatically across regions and time periods. Now, what you see before me is the suicide bomber who targeted the hotel that day. He was an Al-Shabaab suicide operative. He was in his 40s, mid-40s. That alone is, of course, quite unusual. Al-Shabaab is the Shadi, which is, of course, the suicide operations. They rely often on young people, teenagers, that they often indoctrinate from the young age. Individuals who have experienced years of this level of indoctrination become the core unit of Al-Shabaab's ideological core. A man in his 40s doesn't fit that profile. Now, his case illustrates something fundamental about recruitment by Al-Shabaab. It's not monolithic. The factors that bring a teenager into Al-Shabaab are not necessarily the same factors that bring a middle-aged man, presumably in his early 40s, is middle-aged, to volunteer for a suicide mission. Now, the suicide bomber was from a subgroup within a dominant Somali clan that has faced historical marginalization for centuries. Although this does not excuse his actions, it's more about understanding the drivers behind it and why he managed to actually sign up for this. Now, in Somalia's clan structure, some subgroups have been historically marginalized, sometimes for centuries as well, excluded from what was once considered a noble status, compelled to pay heavier blood compensations, for instance, barred from intermarriages between different clans, and have been also always been on the fringe for centuries. Now, these aren't abstract historical footnotes. These are lived experiences of these communities, transmitted across generations, shaping identity, and of course, entrenching grievances. So for these reasons and many more, Al-Shabaab is exploiting this dynamic by not selling a revolution, but selling restoration. They tell these marginalized communities that their ancestors were respected, that their clans were noble, and that Al-Shabaab can restore this status. It's about reclaiming a perceived lost position, not creating something new. Now, Al-Shabaab often highlights the clan lineage of the suicide operatives quite deliberately, especially after they conducted an attack. They are signaling to specific communities. They are communicating, we recognize your grievances, we validate your exclusion, we offer you redress. And they do this skillfully with an intent to exploit it systematically. While, of course, poverty, lack of opportunity, ideological factor can enhance it with specific localized clan dynamics, it's also important to get the full picture. The suicide bomber's age, his background, his motivations don't fit the need profile. That's precisely the point. Recruitment in the Horn of Africa, it's context-specific, hyper-local, and it shifts over time and never static. This is a specific example, one tree. Now let me show you the broader pattern, the forest. Then I'll return to more specific examples. Now, when we look at the operational landscape of the Horn of Africa, and what I mean by Horn of Africa, I primarily mean within the context of the IGAD framework, we're dealing with two primary groups, Al-Shabaab, and who was Al-Qaeda's largest affiliate and the wealthiest affiliate, and it's Islamic State Somali province, which is one of the key affiliates of the Islamic State core. They are the two main groups. They are fighting each other as much as they're fighting the government. Of course, Al-Shabaab remains the dominant one. They have the active fighter strength, ranging from 18 to 25,000 rank and file. The annual revenue is quite substantial from taxation, extortion, port revenues, etc. Put that in perspective, of course, the annual budget often exceeds the federal member states in Somalia's annual budget. So you can see that they're very much well resourced. The operational reach, of course, extends beyond Somalia. Like I said, terrorism is not a national issue. It's transnational. It has no borders. They're active in Kenya, primarily in the borderlands in the northeastern region and the coastal region. They operate in Ethiopia's Somali region. They have demonstrated repeatedly their urban capacity to strike urban centers, including Mogadishu, despite the heavy security presence. The Islamic State Somali province, of course, by contrast, is very much smaller, numbering around 8,000 fighters, primarily foreign fighters. They are concentrated in the northeast, at the top in the purple highlight, is where the Islamic State is primarily concentrated, in the Puntland region. Their finances also are relatively modest, 10 to 15 million a year, or 15 to 20 million a year. So for a number of years also their numbers did not grow, but that changed, of course, and I'll explain to you shortly. Now, of course, both use Somalia's coastal positioning strategically. The arms trafficking networks running between Yemen and Somalia have operated for decades. They access them through existing smuggling routes that have functioned across these coastal regions for generations. Of course, both groups are multinational. Al-Shabaab has long recruited foreign fighters, although the profile has shifted over time. The Islamic State, of course, by contrast, has attracted a significant amount of foreign fighters from the MENA region and, of course, from the East African region as far as Europe and Canada. They've attracted very skilled fighters, IED experts, engineers, physicians, etc. So you can see this is not a localized threat. It's a transnational movement embedded within local context. There's also important tensions here between the transnational and the local, between the global jihadist project and, of course, the domestic Somali clan politics. This tension is very important to understand how these groups operate as a result. Now, when it comes to Al-Shabaab, we have to look at Al-Shabaab not as a static actor, but as an actor that keeps shifting its recruitment stages over the years. Now, when you look at the first phase of Al-Shabaab from 2007 to 2008, Al-Shabaab's recruitment was often primarily driven by nationalist sentiment against the Ethiopian occupation, because Ethiopia was at that time occupying or being based in Mogadishu, driving out the Islamic courts. They were there to support the transitional federal government. And of course, that intervention has proved catastrophic. It unified opposition, but it also gave Al-Shabaab the food to recruit more fighters who, of course, were who had grievances towards this occupation. Now, during this period, Al-Shabaab's recruitment was quite broad-based, but also with limited aims. I mean, they were not thinking about capturing Ethiopia or Kenya or having some sort of a regional emirate, but the appeal was quite simple. We're fighting an occupation by our historic enemy, the Ethiopians, and for so many Somalis, that narrative was quite powerful, regardless of the ideological alignment with Al-Shabaab or not. Then we moved to phase two, 2009, 2011. And this is where shift happens. You had Ahmed Abdi Godane, who was then the emir of Al-Shabaab, or the leader of Shabaab. He was quite a transnationalist who often saw Al-Shabaab as more than a local outfit, but more as a regional actor that should be aligned with the global jihadist landscape. The nationalist camp within Al-Shabaab, of course, were pushed aside. He tried to align Al-Shabaab more broadly with Al-Qaeda. Of course, initially he was a bit unsuccessful, but gradually he managed to succeed. And of course, this also gave the appetite for a lot of foreign fighters to enter Somalia. The group's brutality increased, especially against the Sufi communities, but also against domestic clans who resisted the authorities. Critically, Ethiopia withdrew in 2009. That also removed the nationalistic sentiment for people to join Al-Shabaab. Without occupation, why fight? Domestic support for Al-Shabaab began declining. The group's harsh governance, the targeting areas, including the 2009 Shama hotel bombing, the foreign fighter dominance, these factors eliminated communities that initially supported Al-Shabaab. Then we moved to phase 3, which is from 2012 to 2014. By this phase, especially during this phase, internal tensions erupted within Al-Shabaab. You had, of course, Ahmed Abdi Godane, the Al-Shabaab's leader, who was becoming very vocal about his aims and objectives as a transnationalist. And then, of course, also his arguments with the foreign fighters who often swelled the rank and file of Al-Shabaab at the time. Now, the foreign fighters joined Al-Shabaab to also with the intent to move through the ranks to become also leaders of Al-Shabaab. Ahmed Abdi Godane didn't want that. He didn't believe the foreign fighters should have senior positions in Al-Shabaab, and he actually put them down as much as he can. So that's when he started this internal purge, where he targeted the nationalist camp, of course, who had more limited aims, and of course the foreign fighters who often were quite instrumental in Al-Shabaab's rank and file. Many were executed, many were driven, a lot of them defected, a lot of them imprisoned, some of them still in prison. And of course, Ahmed Abdi Godane managed to consolidate his rule in Al-Shabaab. Of course, simultaneously, Al-Shabaab's governance became much more harsher, forced child recruitment, brutal taxation and extortion, arbitrary justice. This, of course, alienated local cooperation much further. We saw in this period self-defense militias emerging, primarily clan-based, what we call now the Ma'awis label. These clan militias, of course, were not ideological driven. They were pragmatic, and they were often responding to Al-Shabaab's harsh measures. Godane, Al-Shabaab's leader, was killed in September 2014 by a US airstrike. That marked the end of this phase. The final phase, which is the current phase that we're now looking at when it comes to Al-Shabaab, is managed by the current leader of Al-Shabaab, Ahmed Ibrahim, or Al-Ubaida, who succeeded Godane. He restructured Al-Shabaab from within it. Now, Ibrahim is local. I mean, it's not someone like his previous predecessor or his predecessor who had training in Afghanistan and elsewhere, but he was more quite a local. He never left Somalia, and he also knew that you had to merge a transnationalist approach with the domestic politics. So the group shifted strategy, which is just not about localizing, but also integrating Al-Shabaab into the clan structures of Somalia. They began manipulating clan politics more deliberately. They established the so-called Council of Clan Elders in areas under their control. They created mechanisms for local power sharing. So they were not replacing the clan system, they were actually infiltrating them. I think the key aspect is that they were also targeting the historically marginalized communities, because now that you have the nationalist camp who already left Al-Shabaab, the Ethiopians are no longer inside Somalia at that time. How do you recruit more people? That's when they shift towards a marginalized community and really try to appeal to them in mass. This was, of course, not a linear shift towards hearts and mind. It was also very cyclical. When Al-Shabaab became too harsh, when they made targeting areas, including the 2017 Zoba attack that claimed the lives of almost more than 600 people, local resistance will rise against them, especially the public backlash. The group then will revert temporarily to this so-called softer approach, rebuild local support, and the cycle will repeat. They also began thinking in longer time horizons. They established clan-based recruitment centers for children, where they created these programs that lasted sometimes 5 years of indoctrination, and then they divided the top 20% that were assigned to administrative roles, and the 80% were joined the rank and file of Al-Shabaab. This was a generational recruitment and quite long-term. They were patient and effective. Now, what I've just described, the 4 distinct phases, 4 different recruitment strategies, 4 different appeals to different communities at different times. And this is what I mean by context-specific. Understanding the specific patterns across time is essential. When it comes to the Islamic State Somalia province, they have a different story. But the lesson, of course, quite similar. Context matters. And again, understanding the specific conditions that allow a group to grow or stagnate is also essential. Now, for a long time, since 2015 to 2021, Islamic State was quite stagnatic. They were formed following the defecting foreign fighters and, of course, by a senior Al-Shabaab operative, following, of course, the Ahmed Abdi Godani's purge in the early 2010s. They also knew that they could not rise above the rank that they had in Al-Shabaab, and they knew they wanted a different outfit. They established themselves in Puntland, in the northeast region of Somalia, with no more than 100, 150 operatives. They enjoy support from some parts of the clan communities, especially from the Machetean clan or the Ali Suleiman sub-clan in the Bari region. Of course, the leader, Abdul Qadir Mu'min, belonged to that sub-clan. But for years, they didn't grow. Their focus wasn't local expansion. They were funneling money through an entity called Al-Qarar, which is the regional hub of Islamic State for East Africa, that also funds and channels and facilitates resources to the Islamic State's affiliates in the eastern DRC and Mozambique, and as far as Afghanistan. So they function as a connection point in a transnational financial network, not as a territorial force. Now, of course, 2022 onwards, things have changed. Of course, after the collapse of the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, many years later, fighters began to move to Africa. Africa became the epicenter of global terrorism. Abdul Qadir Mu'min was, of course, elevated within the Islamic State's hierarchy. Of course, we don't know his position. I mean, some say he's the global leader, some say he's the deputy, others say another senior role. But of course, with that elevation came resources, attention, and recruits. Islamic State expanded dramatically in Somalia. They attracted hundreds of foreign fighters, skilled operatives, bomb makers, engineers, physicians, ideologues from Ethiopia primarily, from the Oromo community, the Middle East, Europe. Their ambition, of course, according to the local sources, was to build a force of 10,000 fighters and then seize the commercial port of Bosaso and then establish governance there. Now, of course, their ambition was, of course, stopped temporarily by this anti-Islamic State campaign that was launched in December 2024 by the Puntland forces with the support from the United States and the UAE. The operation, of course, inflicted heavy losses, and by this, the group still remains quite resilient. They adapted, they dispersed, and they're rebuilding. Now, of course, the foreign fighter problem hasn't disappeared. It's migrated. And of course, Somalia, particularly the Islamic State Somalia province, has become a preferred destination for these foreign fighters. Now, this trajectory, of course, demonstrates the same principle. Understanding specific local conditions is essential. Understanding why Islamic State stagnated for 6 years and then suddenly expanded rapidly is also quite important. It requires understanding the specific conditions in Puntland, the clan dynamics in the Bari region, and of course the geopolitical dynamics that are surrounding the Horn and a wider region. When it comes to who's at most risk of recruitment, of course the answer again is not static. It's shift again depending on which period you examine. Of course, mid to late 2000, Al-Shabaab, of course, young men driven by nationalistic sentiment to join the fight against the Ethiopians. Mid to late 2010s, of course, Al-Shabaab defectors who joined the Islamic State Somalia province. But today, of course, the picture has changed. This is where context becomes everything again. Now, let me give the current drivers focusing on Al-Shabaab as an example, because I know I don't have much time and I can talk for hours. In January 2024, Ethiopia and Somaliland signed a memorandum of understanding to gain access to a Red Sea port. Somaliland, in return, was promised consideration for future recognition. Of course, Somalia, which considers Somaliland as part of Somalia, was furious. Now, the federal government in Somalia saw this as a violation of the Somali sovereignty, a betrayal. Now, Al-Shabaab exploited this massively. They increased the recruitment rapidly, tapping into nationalistic and anti-Ethiopian sentiments, similar to how they'd done in the late 2000s. Thousands of new recruits, not because of ideology, not because of poverty, because of geopolitics. Because of a perception, grounded or not, Somalia was under threat. Now, when it comes to governance vacuums, when counterterrorism resources are diverted, whether to political infighting between the center and periphery, or to other priorities, governance vacuums emerge. And this is something that Al-Shabaab skillfully exploits. So in that context, predictability becomes quite the normative power. And it's also important to highlight that many civilians and communities in Al-Shabaab-controlled areas reject the group's ideology. They don't support the group's activities, per se. They don't want their children indoctrinated, but they adapt to the predictable outcomes that Al-Shabaab provides. They offer clarity. The justice system is harsh but consistent. Their taxation, which is a combination of taxation and extortion, is excessive but also transparent. Of course, without credible state alternatives, practical acceptance can turn into active recruitment. And we also have to often assume that economic factors and ideological indoctrination are the primary drivers of recruitment. They are, and they matter a lot. But they only partially explain what's happening. What we are seeing, particularly in Al-Shabaab, it's a strategic exploitation of long-standing clan identities and historical grievances. Certain clans are overrepresented in Al-Shabaab, while other clans are underrepresented. The Rahawain, the Somali Bantu groups, segments of the Gachar clan, why are they overrepresented? I done some research 4 years ago where I looked at why some of these communities are overrepresented, and my findings looked at 4 different categories. First, clan communities that are historically marginalized. Their territories confiscated during the civil war that erupted in 1991. They were excluded from political power, seeking equality. Second is the sub-clans that, while they are part of dominant clans, political dominant clans, they've also been marginalized at the sub-clan level. And of course, the suicide bomber that attacked the Aswa Hotel is one example. So seeking revenge or redress within their own clans and family groups. The third one are sub-clans with historical ideological grounding in Salafism and Wahhabism. For them, Al-Shabaab's narrative aligns with pre-existing ideological identity, albeit to an extreme level. And then fourth, minority sub-clans that, while often they are well respected, they lack the national coverage or national leverage unless they align with a very dominant patron like Al-Shabaab. Now, the absence of other clans within Al-Shabaab's ranking, of course, equally revealing. Clans with relatively privileged clans that haven't experienced the same historical marginalization and grievances that other clans have experienced, they don't find Al-Shabaab's narrative quite compelling. Now, what this demonstrates is that Al-Shabaab employs sophisticated recruitment strategies. They use, of course, digital media and traditional media. They tailor messaging to a specific community and specific demographic and clan groups. They frame their appeal around identity, grievances, and, of course, pragmatism. Now, of course, I'm going to show you an example that also demonstrates that marginalization alone doesn't determine recruitment outcomes, but also partially explains it. Now, Ba'adwain is a very small village in the Mudug region. It's inhabited by this very minority sub-clan called the Qubays. They have been historically marginalized by the bigger clans. And in 2021, Al-Shabaab managed to capture that town after 8 years of fighting that community. Now, of course, this doesn't fit the picture when it comes to marginalization. Why did that community fight against Al-Shabaab for 8 years on their own? Even though they've been historically marginalized, they're very quite small relative to other clans. And one thing I found out is that, of course, is the ideological identity. Ba'adwain is traditionally seen as the vanguard of Sufism in Somalia. Given the ideological contrast that they have with Al-Shabaab, who of course are from the Salafist Wahhabi orientation, communities, members, they never could accept Al-Shabaab's rule in those villages. Now, of course, they've ultimately fell to Al-Shabaab in 2021, not through recruitment, but through scorched earth tactics. Al-Shabaab poisoned their wells and destroyed the wells during extreme drought. The community surrendered to survive, not because they were ideologically converted. This also demonstrates that ideological resilience can counter socioeconomic vulnerability, which is, of course, a strength our intervention could easily amplify. So what are the counter responses? The current counter responses existing in this region, of course, is a perceived sense of permanent security. We all know that Al-Shabaab often operates, they currently operate in the southern region of Somalia, South Central, but they're quite absent in, let's say, in Somaliland and Puntland, which is basically the northern regions of Somalia. Why is that? Because, of course, Puntland and Somaliland offer this sense of permanent security. They don't provide them with basic services, but they do provide with one essential basic service, which is security. And this is something that the communities really strive for. So investing in permanent security structures is key, not just military operations, but sustained presence, intelligence capacity, and of course, community policing. It's resource intensive, but it's also where it's been implemented consistently. It had an effect. Good governance, this is the ultimate goal, of course. Transparent institutions, inclusive political processes, service delivery, of course, where local governance has been relatively functional in Somalia and the wider region, recruitment has been also quite lower. Rehabilitation programs. There are defection and reintegration programs and operate outside Mogadishu, which of course is quite a progress. The EU, especially its member states, have supported those DDR programs for many years. But of course, one thing we notice is that most defectors defect in informal pathways, more than through the formal pathways. And that of course concerns us, and we should also understand why that is. Stratcom, credible counter-terror narratives, of course delivered by trusted voices, trusted and credible voices. It can work. Since late 2022, Somalia has convened religious scholars to counter Al-Shabaab's ideology, and of course has engaged in Stratcom quite consistently, albeit it delivered different results. Community-based solutions is also one element. Engaging clan elders, religious elders who of course are credible to both sides and not just to one side. Civil society actors, that of course requires trust, and trust takes time. Education access and youth employment, a region like the Horn, where its youth bulge, of course, in this continental issue, needs massive job creation to prevent idle hands falling prey to violent extremist actors. There have been efforts to expand this access and make youth more visible in the job sector. Now, of course, all these responses have merit. None of them individually is sufficient. And that brings me to the gaps. So when it comes to gaps, predictability, most of the communities in Somalia, of course, want the same basic services that any other human beings want. It doesn't matter who delivers it. And that's, I think, a key issue now that's happening in Somalia and the wider region. Communities, again, tolerate violent extremist organizations, not just because they support them ideologically, but because they provide that level of predictability. They collect taxes. The taxes, of course, are very harsh, but they're consistent. Traders, for example, often choose the cheapest and most trouble-free option, even if it means paying Al-Shabaab. When you have a trader who, for example, unloads items from, let's say, Mogadishu port, and he wants to bring it to Baydhabo in the southwest state, and he has two routes that he can take. One is, of course, government-manned, and the other one is Al-Shabaab-manned. And Al-Shabaab gives him one ticket, one fee that he has to pay, and he's not disrupted towards during his journey. And with the government, of course, he might have to pay 6 or 7 different actors. Of course, the government option might be much more expensive. Cost and benefit analysis, he will take the cheaper and much more efficient option. And this, without the credible state alternative, of course, this predictability becomes also an alternative power in itself. And of course, the problem also with that is that with practical acceptance or tolerance for these types of groups, over time it can also evolve into active recruitment. We also have to understand that Al-Shabaab has been controlling a large amount of territories for almost 20 years. And it's worrying. That means the whole communities, whole young people have grown under Al-Shabaab's rule for such a long time. When it comes to the Stratcom, often the Stratcom engagement in Somalia, especially in the region, is very reactive and, of course, doesn't adhere to the expanding technological advances. Al-Shabaab provides unrestricted funding to two departments that they fund, the communication strategy, or the communication department, and the intelligence wing. They understand that information battle is as important as the kinetic one. They produce slick propaganda outputs, documentaries. They tailor it to very local audiences, and they're quite proactive. The current government Stratcom approaches, while effective to a certain extent, they are by contrast very reactive in nature. Al-Shabaab produce high-quality media. Somali authorities respond with press releases. So competing in the information space is more effectively and much more relevant, especially in the fight against terrorism and especially again in the fight against these terrorist groups. If Al-Shabaab is winning the narrative war, we cannot expect to win the recruitment war. Now, of course, Al-Shabaab's digital presence is also to radicalize and recruit a cohort of different communities. And it's something that, of course, we are looking into it to counter it. International partners, including the EU, of course, are supporting technological capacity building, such as the EU-funded CTEC, to partners in the region encountering the emerging technologies that these violent extremist groups use. The third one is the informal pathways of defections. Now, of course, as I earlier said, most of the defectors of Al-Shabaab are often informal and never through the formal pathways. And this, of course, a growing trend that we see. They use the clan networks, they use personal connections, family, especially mothers, play a very important role when it comes to defection. And these negotiated exits bypass state structures entirely. The reasons, of course, research suggests multiple factors: fear of arrest and prosecution. That's one thing. At the moment, when it comes to the court in Somalia, the terrorism cases are heard by the military court as opposed to the civilian court. There's also the social stigma in communities and limited information, of course, about these formal defection pathways. So the informal pathways, while riskier, of course, feel safer because they're mediated by trusted family networks. So we need to understand this informal mechanism quite clearly and better to also tailor to that. We need to find ways to support them and maybe integrate them into formal pathways without undermining the trust, and that makes them work. Fourth is when it comes to the coordination, and of course, adaptive approaches are needed. Now, there's always a persistent tendency towards uniform approaches. There's, of course, missing the adaptive angle. Recruitment drivers are context-specific. They're often clan ethnic specific. They're time-specific. They're, for example, policy that works maybe in one region like Galmudug might not work, let's say, in the northeastern region of Kenya. An intervention that's very effective against Al-Shabaab might be useless, let's say, against Islamic State, Somali province. So we need coordination, absolutely. But we need to also enhance this coordination at the international level and not just only focus on the domestic level. That also allows for localization, for adoption, for genuine engagement with the specifics of each context. So the final slide, the way forward. And I'll keep this very brief. I know I've been talking for quite some bit. Where does it leave us? Not just for Somalia, but for the Horn of Africa. Again, to reiterate my thesis, or at least the context of this presentation, the core of this presentation, context is everything. We must pay attention to specific local realities that also feed into the regional patterns. The Horn of Africa is not a monolithic region. Somalia is not a monolithic region. Even within Al-Shabaab, recruitment dynamics vary dramatically across the different time periods and different contexts, and also in different regions. Of course, the Somali problem, it's not a country with regional effects. It's actually a regional crisis with Somalia at the center. So what does a context-driven approach look like in practice? Of course, we need to move beyond this, uniform frameworks. As earlier mentioned, the region's counterterrorism strategies need to incorporate a very detailed, context-sensitive understanding of the local socio-cultural approaches and the historical dynamics surrounding these communities. It's not just about sensitivity, but it's also about the effectiveness of the approach. Policies that address historical grievances, that engage with the specific drivers in each locality, these are the policies that can really have an impact. It will also involve educational reforms that provide alternative narratives, but narratives that also resonate with the local identity and not just with the broader patterns, not with imported ideologies, but also with the lower context-specific localities. It also means more involvement with economic development programs, specifically targeted at the marginalized communities. But of course, designed in consultation with these communities, not just for them. Also, when it comes to the second point, which is climate adaptation, we also need to treat climate adaptation as a secured investment. Every water point we establish is a recruitment opportunity we deny violent extremist organization. Every climate-resilient livelihood we support is a potential fight who stays home. This requires integrating climate adaptation into our counter-terrorism programming, but also not treating them as separate portfolios. They have to be streamlined, they have to be synthesized. The Global Counterterrorism Forum initiative on addressing the nexus between climate change and violent extremism, led by Kenya and Germany, is one important framework to refer to. Third, law enforcement agencies need community buy-in. Security operation, of course, without community support can create grievances that violent extremists often exploit. Credible community stakeholders need to be involved in planning and, of course, oversight, not just informed after operations. Finally, we have to strengthen the proactive STRATCOM engagement in the region. It needs to be very specific identity-based appeals that this group use, the geopolitical narrative that can also impact the recruitment in Somalia, let's say between the MOU between Somalia and Ethiopia. We also need to understand about the historical and cultural context. And critically, these kind of narratives need to be delivered by trusted and credible voices. This means high-level clan elders or credible religious elders who often have credibility by both sides, by the violent extremist organization who often cannot ignore their credibility, but also by the state authorities. So I began this address, of course, with a personal account. The SYL hotel bombing on 30 August 2016. 26 people died, many untold injuries. The security guard that I already spoken that morning, of course, died. The hotel that reopened the next day, the facade that was patched along the courtyard, the swept, that's survival in Mogadishu. That's what they actually perceive as resilience. So this account, of course, is a reminder. Behind every recruitment statistic, there's individual human beings. They make choices in specific contexts shaped by histories we barely understand, by clan dynamics we often simplify, by grievances that stretch back centuries, by governance failures we sometimes, of course, try to reduce. So we need to understand context, listen, localize, invest for the long term. Because that's what these violent extremist organizations are doing. They adapt. The Horn, of course, is not a single narrative. It's multiple interconnected context-specific realities, histories, grievances, identities, dynamics that vary from region to region. That's why I don't like to use the word root causes, because root cause, of course, is not objective. It has a subjective nature to it, depending who you speak to. So if we lose sight of that complexity, if we persist in searching for uniform templates, we tend to repeat the same mistakes. And of course, the cost of these mistakes can be measured in attacks like, for example, the SYL Hotel, one of the many attacks that Al-Shabaab conducts regularly, in funerals, in young people joining these violent extremist groups that offer them so-called clarity, even if it's very distorted. And I leave you to that. Thank you.